New York, a modern metropolis, a city that never sleeps and never stops. The streets are filled with people, cars, and advertisements at every turn. But behind this endless hustle hides a no less intense battle for influence and power. A struggle even the great Donald Trump could feel within himself. Trump, who had long been accustomed to attention, criticism, admiration, and contempt, was in his element. However, this time, he found himself in a situation where even his experience and charisma could not guarantee him an easy victory. He sat in a vast courtroom, where almost every movement of his was captured by cameras, and the eyes of all America were on him. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression and vast experience in high positions, was so convinced of her stance toward Trump that, in her eyes, he appeared to be just another politician who didn't understand the heart of the matter. Her gaze, seemingly burned by years of judicial practice, was filled with distrust and disdain. She not only disliked Trump, she considered him a foolish, short-sighted man who had no understanding of complex legal issues. Judge Grace Martin, the head of this trial, was known for her uncompromising position in political cases. She saw nothing in Trump but a man trying to manipulate the system with his popularity and wealth. And her mission was to prove that even the wealthiest American billionaire could not be above the law. So, when he spoke in court, every word and every movement of his was carefully scrutinized. This won't be easy, Grace thought as Trump first spoke at the hearing. She didn't even try to hide her contempt for his idea. But Trump was a different kind. He wasn't ready to simply submit. He wasn't going to act like an ordinary defendant. Trump knew how to manipulate the situation, but this time, he would have to go through a much more complicated game. "Do you have any questions, Mr. Trump?" Grace asked, smiling, but her smile clearly lacked warmth. Trump calmly raised his head, his eyes focused and penetrating. He didn't rush, as always. He gave everyone time to figure out what was happening. He understood that the judge had long since formed her opinion of him, and that only added complications to the situation. But he wasn't about to give up. "Judge Martin," he responded calmly, "I'm listening, but I want to emphasize that what you think of me doesn't matter. What matters are the facts, and I'm ready to present them one by one." Grace Martin responded with a slight smile, one that left no room for doubt. She had long been convinced that Trump was just a political fraud, and this trial would be another proof of his inadequacy. "I hope your facts are as convincing as your political statements, Mr. Trump," she replied, not hiding her irony. Trump smiled, but his eyes grew sharper. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't about to back down. Everyone expected him to fade into the background under pressure. But that didn't happen. "I'm not a political fraud, Judge Martin. I'm just a man who knows how to play by the rules. And you know them too. So let's get to the heart of the matter." Judge Grace Martin raised an eyebrow, but her expression remained unchanged. She was serious and ready to prove her point by any means. At that moment, Trump paused to give everyone time to reflect. He looked at the judge with a deep gaze, one filled with resolve and determination. "I won't give up," he said, "and I know there's something in this case that will make you change your mind about me. Just don't think you control the game. This is my game." Everyone in the courtroom held their breath. Judge Martin raised an eyebrow, not trying to hide her interest in his words, but she also understood that Trump had decided to put everything on the line. Now it was only a matter of time. There was something more between them than just a legal conflict. It was a battle of two great personalities, two forces, ready to clash in a fight that could change a lot of things. And what was happening now was just the first step toward something significant. Would Trump really prove that he was much more than just a former president? Or would Grace Martin break him? The courtroom was dark and heavy, with high ceilings that echoed the sound of every step. At both ends of the vast room sat lawyers and their clients, while above them loomed federal judge Linda Jackson, a middle-aged woman with a stern demeanor, her eyes cold and unyielding, as she closely watched every movement of Donald Trump. The entire trial was built on accusations against the former president, who, according to his opponents, not only lacked experience, but was also utterly incompetent in matters of governance and justice. Many in the room saw him as more of a politician than a true legal expert. To them, he was a symbol of chaos and disrespect for established norms. Judge Jackson was typically uncompromising, even with high-profile figures, and she treated Donald Trump like any other defendant, with suspicion. Her statements were direct, and she wasn't shy about expressing her opinion on his public speeches, which often seemed shallow and nonsensical. But now, as the case gained momentum, everything was changing. "Mr. Trump," the judge began, with the air of someone who had clearly decided she would do things her way. "You are under judicial investigation for your numerous violations of the law during your time as president. I'm sure you're aware of how important this process is to society." Trump sat calmly, showing no emotion. He was dressed in a dark suit that contrasted with the color of the walls and the atmosphere in the room. His hands were folded on the table, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge. "I understand, Your Honor," he replied calmly, "but you and your colleagues have forgotten one important thing. Justice is not merely a matter of who speaks the loudest. It should be based on facts, not political manipulation." These words came as a surprise, and several lawyers on the opposing side looked as though they had just suffered a setback. They had prepared to ask even sharper questions, hoping that Trump would fall into the trap of his own overconfidence. However, the judge was not like many might have imagined. She had long realized that the case was not as simple as it seemed at first, and that Trump might not be as foolish as some would like to believe. "You say justice should be based on facts?" she asked, looking at him over her glasses. "Then show us those facts. Where is your evidence of innocence?" Trump did not answer immediately. His face became serious, and he leaned forward, scanning the room as though deciding how to begin. After a few seconds of pause, he spoke, his voice calm but strong. "Justice does not mean the destruction of those who differ from the mainstream view. I don't have to be like everyone else to be right." His tone was steady, but powerful. A strange silence spread through the room, and even the judge, who was used to tense and heated arguments, seemed to begin listening to him more attentively. "I'm not asking you to be like everyone else," the judge said, a bit softer than before. "But you've called into question institutions that have been symbols of stability for decades. So I believe you should demonstrate your ability to operate within that stability." "I will demonstrate," Trump responded, and there was something so firm in his words that it felt not just like an answer but a promise. And not just to you, to the whole world. For the rest of the trial, tension built as lawyers questioned Trump about his actions during his presidency, and witnesses cast doubts on his decisions. But each time he responded, his words were logical and well-founded, something many hadn't expected. Trump showed that he was not only a politician, but also a strategist capable of working with legal details. Judge Jackson tried to maintain her composure, but couldn't help noticing how her approach was changing. She began listening more carefully to each of his arguments, and while she didn't agree with him on many points, her perception of Trump began to shift. By the end of the day, as the hearing drew to a close, the judge, looking thoughtfully at Trump, said, "You will likely become the center of attention once again, but this time it won't be a battle of emotions. You've now become an opponent I must respect for your ability to persuade." The room was filled with silence, lasting for a few seconds before the break began. And though the verdict had not yet been delivered, many in the courtroom felt that the case was far from as clear-cut as it had seemed at the start. When the courtroom filled again for the continuation of the hearing, the atmosphere was difficult to describe in words. There was even a faint smell of old books and wood, which was part of the architecture of this historic court. All eyes were focused on Trump, whose confidence remained unchanged. But even he could feel that the case was becoming more complicated, and that fewer people were supporting him than before. Judge Jackson began the next part of the hearing with a question to the prosecutor, Mr. Benjamin Wells. Mr. Wells, do you have any additional testimony or new facts that might confirm the seriousness of the charges against Mr. Trump? Wells, a man in a velvet jacket, looked composed, although his face showed signs of fatigue. He was an experienced lawyer who had been involved in high-profile investigations for many years. He now had every reason to believe that victory was nearly inevitable, but the longer the trial went on, the more uncertain he felt. Your Honor, he began, our witnesses have provided clear testimony that during Mr. Trump's presidency, numerous violations of the law occurred, particularly regarding the use of personal contacts to achieve political goals. These facts are crucial for understanding his actions. We are ready to proceed and prove that he broke the law, violated ethical standards, and as a result, harmed society. Trump remained still. His face showed no emotion. But everyone sitting at his table noticed how his right fist involuntarily clenched. You claim that I broke the law? He asked with a furrowed brow, as if the question made no sense. But how do you know that these accusations have any real basis? Judge Jackson signaled to continue. Mr. Trump, she said, her voice cold but not without sympathy. You deny all the accusations, despite the fact that your former advisors and partners have confirmed that many of your decisions were under significant pressure from business and personal interests. How do you explain this? Trump raised his hand, signaling that he wanted to respond. Your Honor, he began, these accusations are fabricated. I worked for the people. My actions were aimed at improving our country, and every step I took was done with a sense of responsibility. As for business, I always tried not to confuse personal interests with public ones. I didn't do anything that could have broken the law. The courtroom fell silent again when a witness, a former member of Trump's administration, stood up to testify. His name was Jonathan Hart, and he looked like a man who had long understood the importance of every word he spoke. Your testimony will be very important for the case, Mr. Hart. Judge Jackson addressed him. Please tell us about your work in the Trump administration. Which decisions, in your opinion, were made without proper legal support? Hart didn't rush to answer. He gathered his thoughts, knowing that his testimony could change the course of the trial. Your Honor, he began, I was present at many internal meetings, and I can say that, unfortunately, many of the decisions made did not meet the standards we would expect from a president. In particular, there are several cases where the team was unable to clearly assess the legal consequences of decisions, especially concerning foreign policy and trade. This created risks for national security. The room went quiet again, and even Trump made no comment. But it was clear from his eyes that he disagreed with what Hart was saying. Even he understood that this was not just a statement, it was a reality he would have to accept. Mr. Hart, Judge Jackson asked, turning back to the witness, do you believe that the decisions made by Mr. Trump can be considered ethical violations? Hart appeared uneasy, but answered honestly. I don't want to make categorical statements, Your Honor, but many of the decisions Mr. Trump made had significant legal and ethical consequences. And I believe they should have been made more cautiously. I'm not just talking about political interests, but also about how his actions affected people and institutions that weren't prepared for such an approach. After Hart's words, the tension in the courtroom increased. Everyone realized that his testimony could have a significant impact on the case. Trump, still, made no sharp movements, but even his closest advisors noticed how difficult this trial was for him. And although he appeared determined, it was clear that more and more people were beginning to doubt whether his presidency was as flawless as he claimed. The courtroom remained silent when Trump's lawyer stood up to make his closing statement. Your Honor, he began, we do not dispute the importance of analyzing the president's decisions, but allow me to emphasize that in every case, there were serious factors that influenced the situation. The president always acted with the best intentions. This was not the end of the trial, but it was already clear. The question wasn't who was right, but who had more opportunity to prove their case. The courtroom became even tighter with tension as Judge Jackson announced a break to give both sides time to prepare for new testimony. Everyone present understood that this case could determine a great deal for the country's political landscape. There was a palpable tension in the air that filled the atmosphere, and people sitting in the courtroom could feel their hearts beating faster with every passing minute. As soon as the judge announced the break, several of Trump's lawyers and advisors began intensely reviewing documents and correspondence. Their faces grew serious. They knew that the new testimony presented by the prosecutors could have a fatal impact on their client. "It's not that simple," said one of Trump's lawyers, flipping through the new testimony. "They have strong arguments, but we can still persuade them in the courtroom." Trump stood by the table, leaning over the documents. His face, though devoid of emotion, looked weary. He knew that every word, every action was a step towards his political and legal fate. If he didn't come out of this with the maximum benefit, it could mark the end of his political career. A few minutes after the break was called, a witness named Ellen Moore was called to the stand. She had been a former advisor who worked in Trump's administration from the time of his election until the end of his first term. Moore was a strong middle-aged woman with decades of experience in public service, and her testimony could prove to be a pivotal moment in the case. As she took the stand, Judge Jackson asked, "Ms. Moore, please tell us about your experience working in Mr. Trump's administration. Were you ever witness to any situations that you believe might fall under the category of legal or ethical violations?" Ellen lifted her head and began speaking slowly. Her voice was clear and calm, but every word sounded important and measured. "I worked at a high level in the administration," she said, "and I witnessed how some decisions were made in circumstances where necessary legal consultations were simply ignored. Maybe I can't say that it was all illegal. But there was a situation where Mr. Trump was put in conditions where his actions could be seen as attempts to influence electoral processes in other countries. Refusing to consult with state lawyers seemed like a mistake. One of these situations involved important negotiations with foreign leaders, where orders were made without proper legal assessment of the consequences for national security." These words immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room, and Trump himself seemed to feel how hard it became to breathe. The look in his lawyer's eyes grew even tenser. "Ms. Moore, you're speaking of specific instances," Judge Jackson asked. "Can you provide any concrete examples or additional facts to support your claims?" Ellen Moore paused and said, "Yes, I have records from some meetings where we discussed international issues, in which Mr. Trump was ready to act without consulting legal experts. These moments are documented. They confirm that some decisions could have harmed the security of our country and the trust in its government." This was another serious blow to Trump's position. His lawyers began reviewing their strategies on the fly, and even he realized it would be hard to avoid questions on this issue. A silence fell over the room. For those watching the proceedings, the situation seemed so realistic that they began to believe this could truly be part of their everyday life. A few minutes later, Trump's lawyer stood and asked for the floor. "Judge," he began, "I would like to emphasize that Mr. Moore's testimony is subjective, and it cannot serve as the basis for serious legal conclusions. All these situations can be interpreted as normal political decisions that have their own specifics. As for the lack of legal consultations, sometimes decisions need to be made quickly to protect the interests of the country." But prosecutor Mr. Wells didn't back down. "Judge, I must emphasize that such decisions without proper legal consultation could lead to serious violations of the law. We have every reason to believe that in these instances, not only the ethical code was violated, but also U.S. laws." This triggered a new wave of discussions among those present in the courtroom. But Trump remained silent, knowing that the next few days in court would be decisive. All thoughts were now focused on whether he could defend his reputation and preserve his political career. At this stage, one thing was clear. The battle was far from over, and this case would become a major milestone in American history. The courtroom hummed quietly as the attorneys for both sides prepared for new testimony. Everyone present in the courtroom knew that the upcoming moments could determine the outcome of the trial. Some wiped the sweat from their brows, others reviewed documents, while Trump sat in his seat, staring intently at the edge of the table. His nervous gaze betrayed the internal struggle he was facing. Judge Jackson returned to the bench and immediately addressed the attorneys. She had already emphasized several times the importance of this case, noting that the public was eagerly awaiting the decision. Every word, every piece of evidence could be decisive. "All right," said the judge, "please continue. We have more witnesses who need to share important information." As soon as she made this announcement, the prosecutors called the next witness, James Parker. He was a former employee of the Federal Security Service and had access to confidential information related to the security of the electoral process. After Parker took the stand, the judge asked, "Mr. Parker, you worked in a high position within federal agencies. Can you tell us if there were any facts that raise concerns about Mr. Trump's actions during his presidency, particularly in relation to the electoral process?" Parker stared at the papers in front of him, trying to recall all the details. Then, as if deciding it was time to tell the truth, he began to respond. "My job was to ensure the security of the electoral process. During 2016, and again during President Trump's second term, I saw how some actions by senior officials violated security norms and standards. For example, I was directly involved in operations concerning cybersecurity for the electoral systems, and during this period, we noticed unusual attempts to influence the outcome of the elections by foreign states. In many cases, instead of acting through proper channels, some high-ranking officials chose more aggressive and risky methods. It seemed that President Trump's administration wasn't fully aware of the consequences of their actions." The lights in the room dimmed for a few seconds, and everyone fell silent. Now, the prosecutors had real evidence. Trump seemed to try to steady himself, but his calm posture revealed his inner unease. This testimony was not just another fact. It could serve as the foundation for serious changes in this case. Trump's attorneys immediately rose to their feet and began to protest. "This is completely baseless," one of them said. "Mr. Parker, you are talking about assumptions. You have no concrete evidence to support your claims." But Prosecutor Wells responded with a rebuttal. "Your objections are just attempts to obscure the facts. Mr. Parker's testimony confirms that there were attempts to influence the elections, and these were not limited to one or two incidents. This became a pattern. And once again, we are talking about not just ethical violations, but real threats to national security." Trump sat motionless, his fingers trembling as he recalled the moments when, perhaps, not everything had been done by the book. His attorneys tried to challenge the testimony, but Judge Jackson left the decision for further consideration. The courtroom grew tense, and even at that moment, people outside the courthouse began discussing the new testimony, spreading the information through social media. Television channels were broadcasting every movement of the witness, every new detail. All present, especially older individuals, understood that this case was about more than just personal interests. It was about the political stability of the country. It felt like real events unfolding before their eyes. The judge called for another break, giving time for additional arguments. However, it was already clear that for Trump, this case was taking on an entirely different scale. Even if he tried to defend himself, he would still have to face serious consequences for his political career. The courtroom remained on pause, everyone preparing for the next stage of this tense battle. The courtroom became even quieter. Judge Jackson announced that it was time for closing arguments. All participants in the trial prepared for the moment, when this issue would be decided once and for all. The room filled with tension, even the older people present, hearing all the accusations and testimonies, began thinking about the future of the country and what they had personally experienced in their lives. Trump's attorney, standing at the podium, made his final statement. "Your Honor, we do not deny that mistakes were made, but that does not mean our client acted intentionally or with the intent to break the law. His actions were aimed at protecting national interests, even if sometimes the methods appeared questionable. I ask you to remember the high office of the president and that politics has always been a complicated game where unpopular decisions had to be made." But Prosecutor Wells, rising for his final word, responded, "Your Honor, this is not a matter of politics. It is a matter of justice. This is not just election manipulation or undermining trust in democratic processes. This is a matter of national security. We cannot allow one person to put their interests above the safety and stability of an entire country." After a few minutes of tense silence, Judge Jackson addressed those present. "I have concluded that we have enough evidence to find Mr. Trump guilty on several counts. The actions that took place during this period cannot be justified. However, it is important to note that this is not the only factor to be considered." The room fell silent. Trump sat still, his gaze fixed directly on the judge. He had no power to influence the outcome. Everything had already been said. Given the importance of this case, I issue the following ruling. President Trump is found guilty of abuse of power. However, due to unforeseen circumstances and the political consequences of this decision, the court imposes a penalty of a large fine and disqualification from running in the next election. The entire room went quiet as the judge announced the final verdict. Some people began to whisper, others simply stood in silence. It seemed as though the very atmosphere in the room had changed. This is an important decision not only for Mr. Trump, but for the country as a whole. I hope it will serve as a lesson for future leaders, the judge concluded. Trump left the courtroom, not smiling, but not looking completely defeated either. He was prepared for further legal battles, but he already felt that his political path had changed forever. The older people who had remained in the room watched this with great attention. Their lives had gone through many difficult moments and political changes, and now they were witnessing yet another significant shift in the country's history, one that could mark the beginning of a new era. There was only one question left. What would happen next for Trump and for the country after this historic decision? But for all those who testified in this trial, and for those who had followed every step closely, the court's decision was an unforgettable and truly pivotal moment in history.